ICQ Podcast episode 375, The Fed Files. Well, hello fellow amateur radio enthusiasts, and welcome to our 375th episode of the ICQ Amateur Radio Podcast. Supported this episode by Scott McDonald, Kilo Alpha 9 Papa, and our monthly lens subscription donors. In this episode, Martin MNMRB is joined by Dan, Kilo Bravo 6 November Uniform, Edmund, Mike 0, Mike November Golf, and Ed, DD5 Lima Papa, to discuss the latest amateur radio news. Myself, Colin, M6BOA, rounds up the news in brief, and this episode's feature is a feature called The Fed Files. Well, as always, it's your very kind donations and support to the ICQ podcast that keeps us going and keeps us advert-free and producing the show for you. In this episode, we'd like to thank Scott McDonald, KA9 Papa, and he sent us along a one-off donation, and he said, congrats, guys, on a great trivia test showing, and he is very, very complimentary towards the team, which we appreciate. And it says that we were so very close to winning, and as they sent us a donation to buy everybody a well-earned pint, for taking part in the quiz. So thank you very much for your very kind words, Scott. Really do appreciate it. If you haven't checked out the quiz that the team did against the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, you can find that on the homepage of icqpodcast.com. Just scroll down to the ICQ podcast videos and you'll find it there. As I say, the easiest way to find that showing. Now, Scott's donations, along with our monthly subscription donors, are the base that pay our way, keep us advert free, and keep us investing into the community. So, what we ask you to do is to hopefully enjoy our show, and then when you've enjoyed it, go along to icqpodcast.com/donate and turn that value you've got from our show into a monetary figure. Select one of the options or choose your own that best matches that figure and send it our way, and say that will go towards our running costs and continue to improve everything we do for you. Now we need to generate that opportunity of value by joining Martin, Dan, Edmund and Ed to discuss and generate thoughts about the latest amateur ham radio news, including Youth Preparedness Awards and pubs and clubs on the air. As always, hope you enjoy.
Well, hi guys, and welcome to episode 375 of the ICQ podcast, and this episode's news roundtable for that episode. Tonight, I'm joined by Mr. Dan Romanchik KB6NU. Hi, Dan.
Hi, guys.
Good to have you. And I missed you the last time you was on because I was off with the dreaded lurgy, and I know you've had it as well, Dan.
Yeah, that was pretty nasty. I don't wish that on anyone.
No, I agree with you on that one. But we're both okay now, so that's good news. We also have Mr. Edmund Spicer, M0MMG. Hi, Ed.
Hello there, Martin. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, and Edmund and I, probably you'll tell them all, but I was with you for a few hours on Sunday, so that was good fun. And popping over to Germany, Mr. Ed Durrant, DD5LP. Hi, Ed.
Hello, guys.
Did you get out and do much SOTA over Easter?
I got out this morning.
Oh.
Getting up at 5 a.m. to go out to bag lots of DX into VK and ZL.
Sounds interesting to me, put it that way.
So I'll probably end up with a different dreaded lurgy of cold from being out in the freezing cold so early. But no, we'll survive.
Hopefully you will, mate. No problems at all. Right, let's have a look at our first news story. Youth Preparedness Award for high school students. I think this is very interesting because not only have they got a way of getting onto amateur radio and they're encouraged to do their technician's license, but there's a lot of training that they're doing for preparedness and radio preparedness. I'm going to ask Dan to go first because this is in the States. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, this is a great story. So the Clovis High School Teen CERT, and that's CERT, Community Emergency Response Team, got this award from FEMA. CERT's a FEMA program. And Yeah, it's ham radio is still a big component of emergency preparedness, and that's good.
Yeah, well, as I say, you guys do a lot more emergency preparedness in the States. I know because being a massive landmass, a lot of these things actually happen where you are more often than, say, we get them in the UK. So,
Well, not only that, different areas of the country have different emergency types, if you will. So, for example, in California, they'll have forest fires, and in Oklahoma, that's tornadoes, and in Florida, it's hurricanes. So, it's a different type of emergency in every part of the country. And fortunately, this is kind of an amusing thing. Fortunately, here in Michigan, we have one of the lowest incidences of natural disasters. So I always tout that as a good point for Michigan. People should move here if they don't want to have hurricanes or tornadoes or whatnot.
yeah, I think you got to know your geography if you're moving anywhere, and I think you made a wise move. I know every time I drive down to Edmonds, about a third of the way down, we go through a village or the outskirts of a village called Dorking in the area of Surrey. And Dorking is the lightning capital of the world. So for our radio amateur guys in the UK, don't move to Dorking. Anyway, what's your thoughts, Edmund?
I never knew that, because that's not too far away from where I live. Is it something to do with the geography of the Surrey Hills?
That's my belief. It's because you've got the North Downs behind you, and then you've got the plain, and then you've got the South Downs, haven't you?
Yes, it could be like a little microclimate. But in terms of that, I can really add to the to what Dan has said. I don't really know what to say about this, if I'm honest, Martin.
All right. Well, as I say, it's an interesting concept. Ed, what's your theory on this? I mean, you were saying we almost got caught out by the cert, didn't we?
Yeah, I'm trying to work out where the cert came from, but Dan's clarified that it's a program from FEMA, and this award is actually given by FEMA to a group that's doing well, and the Clovis High School group, they've actually earned this award from what is a government organisation, and that in itself is a very positive thing, especially that there is amateur radio involved in it, but they have to go through, looking at this, about 5 or 6 different training courses with all the relevant emergency services people or their interface to them. And well done to the Clovis High School, and well done to FEMA having awards around to give to groups and schools, etc., that are preparing for the worst. The old saying is prepare for the worst and enjoy the best. But as you've already said, in the US, depending where you are, you've got various natural disasters, and the more prepared people are, and especially younger people, the better. So well done, Clovis.
Yeah, well done, guys, as well, for your award. And I think it's a very, very good thing. And with a lot of things in amateur radio, if you have a purpose to do them, it makes a lot more interest when you go out operating. And if you just go out and operate with nothing planned, then sometimes you get hijacked and you don't have as much fun. Right, move to our next news story. There's a solo voyager that's just passing Hawaii. Dan, you put this one in, so I'm going to let you go first again on this one.
Oh, well, thanks. So, yeah, this is actually an interesting story. This guy, Kenichi Horie, is 83 years old, I think. He's doing a cross-Pacific trip. And apparently, and I didn't know this when I first read the story, he's done this many times, going back to his 20s even. And he's actually quite a well-known yachtsman. But here he is, 83, and doing it solo. And of course, the ham radio connection here is he's got a ham radio set on his boat, and he likes ham radio. The story says, although Horie carries a satellite phone, communicating with others through a ham radio remains one of his favorite pastimes. So I thought that was pretty cool. I've never heard of this guy before, but he does sound like quite the yachtsman.
He certainly does, and if he's out at sea on his own, and we're not sure if he's on his, I think it's his solo trip, I think.
Yeah, solo.
Yeah, it would. Having somebody to talk to would certainly pass the time and make it far more bearable. So that's where ham radio really scores, I would suggest. Right.
Yep.
Ed, what's your thoughts?
Well, I've got a little bit more about the history of Kenichi, or Kunichi, it should be pronounced, Horie. When he was 23, he sailed from Japan to San Francisco, yes, in the yacht. And I'm pretty sure that was the first time single person non-stop trip that was made. So he got the first one. And he's also now going to be the oldest person going in the opposite direction. So the yacht's 19 feet or 5.8 meters long, so it's small. And yeah, as we've said, he's got all kinds of technology on these days, of course, but prefers to use ham radio. And yeah, he expects to get home early June. So his progress is doing well. So he's got a website where you can track where he's got up to, but as the report says, he's just passed Hawaii on the way back from the US to Japan. Good luck to him. Let's hope he doesn't meet any storms or anything, and indeed becomes the oldest person to ever sail that route, solo and non-stop. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah, this is a great story of achievement from somebody like that. Edmund, you live on the south coast. You must have something to say about this, and equally, do you work many maritime mobiles where you are?
Occasionally there will be maritime mobile activity in this part of the world, but it's mostly on 2 meters and in the English Channel and the Solent rather than further afield. There was a special event station this weekend just gone past on Bramble Bank, which is a sandbar in the Solent that is uncovered quite rarely, and the people taking part in that were operating maritime mobile on the way there and back, so that was quite nice to hear. But I've certainly never heard anything on HF from the part of the world where this gentleman is travelling through. If you want to have a listen, I think from memory 14.300 on the 20 metre band or thereabouts is a good place to listen for maritime mobile activity. Martin, back to you.
All right, that's good news. And let's say, hats off to the gentleman. He's doing something he probably enjoys very much, and you wouldn't do this sort of thing if you didn't enjoy it. But having the solitude and the time to be able to do amateur radio, I think is great. And he must have a lot of pressure taken off him in our world. But don't saying it's easy, because there must be a fair amount he has to do with the yacht. But good on him. That's what I'm going to say. Good on him. Right. Our next news story. Amateur radio helps rescue injured Californian outdoorman. Ed, what's your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I thought you were going to pass that over to Dan because it's a US story. But yeah, this is one where it's been in the news recently, where a group are out there. A couple of them had their radios with them, and there was one of their members was injured and had to be flown out by a helicopter. And to add to the story, as they were walking out of the area they were in, they met a motorist who had broken down, so they actually helped him as well to get to the next village so that he could get assisted as well. So they had quite an eventful trip out, this OGMC, the Old Goats Mountain Club. So they've had both one of their own friends slipped and had to be flown out, and also helped a stranger as well. So it's always good to be prepared.
Certainly is, and I think the price of 2.77 rigs these days, the cheaper ones, you can leave one in your door pocket of your car and just grab it if you get out of the car. You have to go anywhere, or if you're out and about, this sort of thing. Dan, what's your thoughts?
So one interesting thing about this story is that there's actually what's called a wilderness protocol for calling for help in the wilderness, just like these folks found themselves. Now, I don't know if they actually use this protocol, but I would suggest that if you're a hiker or a biker or whatever, you might want to know about this protocol. And basically what it says is that you should get on the simplex frequencies, and usually the 2-meter simplex frequency, 146.8, in the first 5 minutes of the 7 a.m., 10 a.m., 1 p.m., 4 p.m., 7 p.m., and 10 p.m. hours, and call for help. And conversely, you should get on those frequencies at those times to listen for people that might need help. So again, I don't know how much this protocol is used, but I would like to just promote it here because I think this is a great idea.
Well, it certainly sounds it, Dan. It certainly sounds it, and I know that they do it in maritime because I've seen the clocks with the green and red triangles on them. But 3 hours seems a long time apart, but at least you've got a guarantee where people won't be transmitting and they'll actually be listening, which is probably a good thing. Edmund, what's your thoughts on this one?
Well, regarding the wilderness protocol, I think the reasoning is that if you need help and you're running battery-operated equipment and the batteries are almost flat, or you haven't got power to waste with your radio on receive, if you only turn it on at those given times for those 3 minutes and call for help then, knowing that is when people will be listening for you, then it's more advantageous rather than running your receiver constantly. I think that's the rationale behind it, and I must admit I bore the wilderness protocol in mind on my one and only SOTA activation from Campbell Hill in America when we went over there in 2019 for Hamvention. In the event, we weren't up there at one of those times, but I certainly had that in the back of my mind, and I wouldn't have started calling CQ on 146520 until the time had passed. But by coincidence of timing, we weren't up there at a moment that coincided with any of those times. So this is a good news story, isn't it? And probably worldwide, little things like this, like helping motorists who've stranded down who've broken down in a, I think they're called knot spots, aren't they, rather than hot spots, to call for help. It probably happens far more than we realise, and each occasion is a good opportunity to publicise amateur radio in a good light. So if you ever manage to help somebody like that and use amateur radio, then it's always worth putting a message into your local newspaper or such to see if we can get some good publicity for the hobby, Martin.
Yeah, that's certainly a good idea. Certainly a good idea, and well worth a thought on that one. But yeah, so it's all good. And as you say, maybe we need to have a worldwide wilderness plan. Be good. Right. I'm going to move to the next news story that seems to have grown quite significantly on the page while we've been talking. Strange slow pulse signals on 11 meters broadcast band. Interesting. They say most of us didn't really realise that there was an 11-metre broadcast band, but you seem to know a bit more about this, Edmund, so I'm going to let you go first.
Yes, there is, although I don't ever recall hearing a signal on it, but that could be because I don't really ever go out of my way to listen. It's very rarely used by broadcasters because of the vagaries of propagation around about those frequencies. The same thing that makes the 10-meter band really attractive to radio amateurs has the opposite effect on broadcast stations on 11 meters who want sort of reasonably predictable propagation for the audience that they want to serve. So this band has been used in the 21st century, but in the first decade more so than recently, for experimental transmissions, most notably using DRM, Digital Radio Mondiale. From the description of this signal, I don't think it's that, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that there is some experimental broadcast standard being transmitted in that band. Failing that, it could be local interference from, for example, a switch mode power supply in the listener's shack in Cork who has reported this. And by coincidence, a similar switch mode supply could be in use very close to the SDR at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. But off the back of this, I will monitor that band a little bit more. And if you fancy having a listen, there is a broadcast radio station on the air 24 hours a day on a frequency in that band. And I don't think they run a great deal of power. I think they're in the watts or the hundreds of watts rather than the kilowatts league. And I am racking my brains trying to remember the frequency they use and the name of the radio station, and I can't remember either. I'm pretty sure that they're based in Denmark, but after several long days at work, my brain has completely collapsed. So if I can work out what I'm talking about by the time the podcast is released, I'll put a link in the ICQ podcast Facebook group. How about that?
Well, that sounds extremely reasonable to me, and I know that you've had a couple of long days, but I believe you got an easy day tomorrow. Hi. Okay, Ed, what's your thoughts on this one? You seem to think it's probably local interference.
No, I mean, the description of the kind of interference, one key point they're saying is that the sharp fall off at the signal edges is unusual, as in it seems to be a very clean signal. And I had thought it sounded to me more like with these 10 kilohertz pulses through the band. To me, it sounded more like interference from a switch mode power supply, but they definitely don't have clean edges. So it's a bit of a mystery. And then I believe Edmund said before we started that it has been known for new broadcast modes to be tried out in the 11-meter broadcast band. Perhaps that's what this is. Yeah, time will tell, as they say.
Yeah, it certainly will, because if they were trying something really new out, they wouldn't necessarily want to keep identing, would they? Because that would set people's expectations higher, I suppose.
Well, except if it's some digital mode and they have been identing, but within the packets, if you don't have the software to receive it and decode the packets, you're not going to see or hear the ident.
That's true, and I wonder whether, I think you can, Dan will tell us this, and I should know having a US license, but I think you can do frequency hopping in the States. You can't do it in the UK. Maybe you're only hearing part of a digital signal every so often because there's somebody using some form of frequency hopping mode. Don't know. Dan, what's your thoughts?
Boy, you got me hopping, and certainly you can't do it on HF. So I think it's only up in the maybe even in the gigahertz region. At any rate, count me as one who didn't know that there was an 11-meter broadcast band. But yeah, an experimental, like the most likely thing here. And maybe, I don't know, maybe some broadcaster is sort of checking out the propagation. We're at the upswing of the sunspot cycle, so propagation in the 11-meter band is going to get better as we go here. Yeah, that's about all I can say on this one.
Something else I have just thought of, incidentally, it's slightly higher in frequency, but I'm aware that in years gone by, computer mice mice is the plural of mouse, isn't it, in a computer context? Is that right?
Yep.
Computer mice have been known to work on 27 megahertz and possibly wireless keyboards as well. So there's a whole load of weird data stuff that inhabits that part of the spectrum. So it could be anything really, and it could just be a coincidence that a similar signal is being received at the University of Twente WebSDR as this chap is hearing in his own shack. I went to a car boot sale last weekend, having been inspired by the feature in the last episode of the podcast. And one of the things on sale there that I didn't buy was a rather expensive looking and impressive looking radio controlled model helicopter. And on the box, much was made of the fact that the remote control operated 27 megahertz. Now, I'm not, by saying that, suggesting for one moment that this signal this chap is hearing in Northern Ireland is being caused by somebody constantly flying a remote-controlled helicopter near his house or anything like that. But there's just so much stuff knocking around in that part of the spectrum. Low-power, short-range devices. It could be pretty much anything. And just in case you were wondering, no, I didn't buy the helicopter because I didn't want to stop any of my neighbours having contacts on Channel 19.
Well, there you go. I was going to say, suddenly as you started talking, I realised that some models do operate on 27 megs. So if somebody's got a transmitter with one of the buttons pushed or stuck in, and it's maybe sitting on a charger somewhere, it could be just transmitting all the time, just pulses. Be quite low, but who knows? But yeah, well, say at least we now admit there is an 11-meter broadcast band, and not just our colleagues in CB are down there. There are other things.
There's actually a 15-meter broadcast band as well.
Yep.
As well as a 15-meter amateur band, and that is very narrow, and they've been doing experiments there with Digital Radio Mondiale as well, DRM.
All right. Okay. Well, that's good. Right, moving to our last news story. A real bit of fun, this one. The guy's been doing this since 2017, we believe. Pubs and clubs on the air. Take your handy-talkie to the pub, sit in the beer garden, and do a bit of operating. What do you think, Dan?
I think this is great. I think I'm going to, it looks like it's mostly an English thing, but I think I'm going to have to promote it here in the U.S. And I love the picture on his webpage. He's showing a picture of the Telegraph pub somewhere in England, I guess. But yeah, I love this idea.
Yeah, it just adds a bit more social to our hobby, and our hobby is very sociable anyway. So that's a good one. Ed, over there in Germany, what do you think?
Yeah, I suppose beer gardens on the air would be probably the German equivalent. Because the pictures they're showing, I think the idea behind this is something to do in the warm months, in the summer or the spring-summer time frame, where you can actually sit outside. Because, yeah, you could take your handy-talkie with you inside and all the rest of it, but It wouldn't be very sociable. Why are you talking into that box? I've got my, mind you, everybody else is talking into the smartphones, so I suppose there's not a lot of difference. But, why do you limit yourself to a HT? Why not just take a good HF rig with you, a battery, a tripod, a mast, and some wire, and take over the beer garden and see who you can work from there? Yeah, it is a bit of fun, and that's always good. And my advice always when doing anything in public is have some brochures with you to hand out about the hobby, especially if you're alone. You can't be operating and explaining at the same time. And also having a brochure makes things seem a little bit more official to people looking on and wondering what's going on. And just wait for the people to come up and ask if you're actually a spy working for some military unit or something. Remembering they've had a few beers and everything else, they could think anything. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah, of course, the spy in the back garden. Hi. One other thing I would suggest, guys, if you're going to do this in a beer garden or a public area, back garden or something where a lot of public around, one of the things you could do is put if you've got like a picnic table, often they've got a hole in the middle for a parasol, and chances are you might actually be able to put your mast down through that and use the table as a support. But what I would suggest is, if you're going to do that in, say, a public house or a beer garden, ask the proprietor first. He's probably going to say, yeah, it's all right. But if we ask him first, two things will happen. We'll be looked on much more favourably and seen as the right type of people to do business with. So, yeah, that's what I'd do. Edmund, last thoughts on this one?
Well, I'll certainly be listening out for stations from pubs and clubs, because in previous years, I must confess, I've never heard any. So maybe 2022 will be the first time. And it's on the weekend after Windmills on the air this year, so there isn't a clash, whereas in previous years, Mills on the Air has tended to take place on the second full weekend. So if the dates had been the same, then there would have been a clash. But this year there isn't. There's a week's gap, so that should be good fun. The website for PACOTA gives hints and tips on how to operate. I'm not sure I'd be brave enough to do it personally, and especially not putting up any kind of large antenna like a sort of half-wave dipole for 40 metres or something, because I think I would be very mindful of not only the EMF regulations that we have to pay attention to these days, but also of families, young children tripping over guy wires or things like that. So if anybody listening to this is thinking of actually activating a pub, then for goodness sake, please do be careful in that respect. And as Martin says, it would be very good form to ask permission from the landlord first. But beyond that, yes, it sounds good fun. It's got to be a bit of a laugh, hasn't it? And I will be listening on the bands that weekend. Martin, back to you.
Well, that's good news. However, it does clash with something I've got in mind to happen one of those days. The event's happening on Friday the 13th of May, Saturday the 14th, and Sunday the 15th of May. And I have a plan, and I'll tell you about that when I do my thing at the end, what we're potentially planning for the 14th. So all in all, that's the news stories done. Just a bit of fun, and I think there's some good stuff in there to just whet our appetite on some of the things we're doing. Now let me find out what the guys have been up to since the last time I spoke to them. Dan, what have you been up to over there in the States?
Well, one thing, I'm getting ready for Dayton. It's 4 weeks from today, and I'm expecting to have a real blast there. But last weekend, I operated the Michigan QSO party, and I got to use the club call sign, which is Whiskey 8 Radio Papa. And the bands were good. People liked the call sign, and I just had a blast. I operated for 6 hours, and I made over 400 contacts, including, and you guys will maybe get a charge out of this, 158 phone contacts. And I'm glad I did, because the phone contacts gave me some multipliers which I would not have gotten otherwise. The multipliers in a state QSO party consist of, for in-state participants like me, any states outside your state, and then all the counties within your state. Well, there was one guy, at least one guy, in a county called Oscoda County, which is a very small place. And I talked to the guy for a little while, and this was on phone. He said he's the only ham in Oscoda County, at least the only active ham. So there's no way I would have worked him on CW, because he was a phone operator. But I had a blast. Those 100, especially the phone. I had 158 contacts on phone in just a little over an hour. So my rate on phone was really phenomenal. And I like to ascribe a lot of that to the use of the call sign, but probably the band conditions were really good too. But that's what I did. That's what I've been doing lately.
Yeah, sounds like you had a hell of a lot of fun, Dan. So that was good. That was good. And you will be at Dayton, as you said. You'll be there for your company you work for. But I'm sure ICQ podcast listeners, if you go and see Dan, I'm sure he'll chat to you the same as we all do.
Well, another thing, I'm giving my talk on CW at Dayton this year, and that'll be on Saturday at 4 p.m. So if you got the time and want to hear me blabber about CW, come and see me.
Yep. And I assume, Dan, you're going to tell them to get on the air. But yeah, great. Okay, Ed, what have you been up to over there in Germany? Is it getting warmer all of a sudden?
Well, not all of a sudden. It's been sunny for several weeks, but it was certainly not warm this morning. I know it was out early, but it was like about probably 2 degrees, but then the wind hits you and it goes quite icy quite quickly. But we're getting there. It's April, so maybe by next month we'll have some nice sunny days. But it hasn't stopped me. I've been getting out doing some both SOTA and HEMA activations of summits around here. And with the bands the way they are at the moment, especially 20 meters, even just with 20 watts and a dipole at 5 meters this morning, I was working into VK and ZL, no problem at all. And also on 40 meters, then you're talking about your rate in the contest. I'm pretty close to that this morning, not as long a time as you've done, but 37 contacts in 20 minutes. So, and that's on phone, and that was chatting to people as well through it. So, a lot of stuff on the bands at the moment. And yeah, if the listeners are thinking about getting back on the HF bands, do it. You won't regret it. Basically, 40's always open, and 40's always busy around Europe and into the US and so on. But then 20 meters is opening quite regularly early in the morning out of Europe into VKZL, Japan, Pacific area on phone, and even with low power with a restricted antenna. So Solar Cycle 25, hello world. Apart from that, my most major thing I've been doing over the last 4 weeks is clearing up my cellar workshop, and I've now got it to a state where I can actually start on some of the projects that I've been wanting to start for the last probably 1 or 2 years. And I always thought, I've got to clear this up first before I can start, because I'll be losing bits. Anyway, I've got a nice clean bench now. I've got all the tools hung up on the wall. I've got things filed away where they should be. And believe it or not, the enjoyment you get out of doing that once you've done it, just do, a bit a day for a couple of weeks. And the result is I can now go down there and know I can start on a project when I want to, and not spend half the time trying to clear the place up or trying to find the parts. So both of which very rewarding. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah, sounds like fun, Ed. Sounds like fun. And as I say, you and Dan are both enjoying yourself. Well, Edmund, what have you been up to
Well, where shall I start? DMR or CW? What do you reckon, Martin?
Well, start with your CW then.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned in the last episode, since the beginning of 2022, I've been trying to master CW, and I've been finding it very, very hard, particularly the head copy side of it. I have had 2 or 3 very minimalist contacts in years gone by, mainly with special event stations, but they've really been 599 TU, thank you, type rubber stamp contacts, and I wanted to do something a bit better than that, so I decided 2022 was going to be the year. So last Saturday I was tuning around 40 meters and heard a relatively slow signal on 7035 kilohertz, and the person calling CQ was Michael, Golf Zero Papa Oscar Tango. So a French station called him and worked him for quite a long time, and I was feeling a bit sort of hesitant, but then he called CQ again, and in a moment of madness I went back to him, and he replied to me, and I copied probably 95% of his transmission, and then it was my turn to reply to him, and I was kind of okay. But then when I put the transmission back to him after that, I think the excitement of me sending my details such as radio, antenna power, all that kind of stuff, the excitement of having sent that kind of overcame me, and I didn't really then copy much of what he sent in reply. So I went back to him and sent something along the lines of, "Sorry, too nervous to copy 7-3, hope to see you again," or words to that effect. But what he then did, very kindly, was he came back to me but kept the speed the same, roughly 12 words per minute, but introduced bigger gaps between the letters, so it was a bit like the Farnsworth method? And that way I was able to copy him, and we did complete the QSO. And he emailed me very shortly afterwards to confirm that it really was him, and yes, I really had done it. So that was very nice. So I've had my first proper CW QSO that's not just rubber stamp stuff. But I would say to anybody listening to this, even if you can comfortably rattle away at 30 words per minute, and you've been able to do that for decades and decades and decades, I would encourage you just occasionally to drop the speed right down and call CQ on one of the QRS frequencies, partly because it will give newbies like me a chance to work you, but the other advantage is that you have probably worked pretty much everybody else who is workable from your QTH who can do 30 words per minute. So if you drop the speed down every once in a while, chances are that not only will you give newcomers an opportunity to actually have a QSO, but you will also get call signs in your log at the lower speed that you would never get in your log if you just carried on time after time going at 30 words per minute. So kudos to Michael to Mike G0POT, and thank you for the contact, and hopefully there'll be a lot more of those as I get better, because what I'm aiming up for is the Platinum Jubilee in June, when those of us in the UK can apply for the Quebec Notice of Variation for our call signs. So that's what I'm working towards. And the other news is DMR. I've had a DMR radio since about 2014, but could never get my head around it at all. And thanks to Martin's kindness and patience in programming the thing up for me, I can now use that to access the ICQ podcast talk group. I was able to do that previously using my Yaesu FT1 XD and System Fusion. And don't get me wrong, that's a great handheld, other than it gets through batteries so quickly, even with the GPS turned off. Just having the radio on receive with no audio coming through, it will flatten the battery in hours. You know, you won't get a day's worth of operation out of it. Whereas my initial impressions are that with the CS 7000 DMR radio I've got, it will sit there quite happily for much, much longer between charges. So I'm hoping this means that I'll be able to monitor the talk group for longer and more often, mainly because the battery in my handheld won't need to be on charge so often. And in saying all of that, I'm not having a pop at Yaesu at all. The FT1XD is a superb little radio. I know it's slightly older now because they're up to the FT5D these days, aren't they? So it's a really good radio. I've had quite a few unsolicited praising comments about the audio quality, so I'm not having a pop at Yaesu for the battery life at all, but I'm hoping the DMR radio will go for longer periods between charges. And thank you, Martin. I couldn't have done it without you.
I think you could, but I gave you a template really to work on. You being a bit generous. I sat down with you with a template, and I know you've put more channels and all sorts of things in it since I was with you. Right.
Can I mention one other thing?
Yeah, go for it.
The weekend after this podcast is released is the weekend that straddles April and May, isn't it? Where the Sunday is the 1st of May. Now, I mentioned Mills on the Air just now. If you are thinking of taking part in that event, then double check the date, because I am sure that in years gone by, Mills on the Air has happened on the second full weekend of the month. Now, if that were to happen this year, it would be the same weekend as Pubs and Clubs on the Air. This year, for whatever reason, the Denby Dale Club that are organising the event have put it on the second weekend, not the second full weekend, which means that this year it's on the 7th and 8th of May rather than the 14th and the 15th. So I just mentioned that just in case anybody or any club out there was thinking about activating their local windmill this year and lugging large amounts of heavy HF equipment up there. The last thing I would want to happen would be for anybody to go to all that effort to then find out that they have turned up at the windmill 7 days too late. So if you're thinking of participating this year, double check the date that you've got in your calendar. Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, good advice, Edmund. Good advice. Right. Well, I mentioned I got something planned. We talked a few episodes back about having an ICQ podcast digital voice activity day. And I've got it in the diary for the 14th of May, which unfortunately does hit the middle week or the middle day of Pubs and Clubs on the Air. What I'm suggesting we do is we have, and I'm going to be on as much as possible between 8 UTC and 20 UTC. I think that's the time I'll do it, between 8 and 8. And the idea is, I'm hoping a number of the other presenters will meet me. This is not necessary just to chat to the presenters. It's let's get as many people on that are ICQ listeners chatting to each other. And I know quite a few of you do already, but just have an activity day. And there'll be no excuse, guys, because with a 12-hour session, if you've got a DMR radio, you should be able to get on for a period of time within the 12 hours. Not many people sleep for 12 hours in a go. So 14th of May, between 8 UTC to 2000 UTC. And that's where I'm planning. I gave Chris Howard back his D-Star radio the other day, which left me a bit isolated, but not for long, because an ICE 92D has come my way to play with, and I reviewed this radio quite some time ago for the podcast, or must be at least 10 years ago. And it was nice to get it back in my hands again and have a look at it and see what I think. I still think it's a lovely radio. However, looking at it today, if you want to program it, you're going to have to program it from the front panel, because certainly in the UK, it's a very expensive programming cable from RT Systems, and most of the dealers haven't got them in stock anywhere in the UK. So seeing as I only need to program it up for the talk group, just to prove that D-Star's working properly, I'm more than happy with that one. Did visit Edmund at the weekend, and we did play with the talk group and co-plugs, as Edmund's mentioned. That was fun. I have been on our club net and the talk group a fair bit, and looks like in South London there's a fair few people have now got 4 meters, and they're starting to talk about let's do something a bit more on 4 meters in London. So another opportunity if you've got a 4 meter FM rig. My shack chair, I bought a shack chair, or must have been 3 months ago. It wasn't cheap, and I bought it off Amazon. I'll mention who I bought it off, because the thing went wrong. I think the weld went at the top of the shaft, and when you sat on it, it was like riding a roller coaster. So I phoned Amazon up and I said, hey, this has gone wrong in 3 months. It's not fit for purpose. And the guy said, I'll give you a refund, and we'll just send it back to us. Here's a returns note, here's a refund. And within 24 hours, the money was back in my bank. So credit where credit's due to Amazon on that one. I've now just got another shack chair. And last but not least, I've put the analyzer on my HF aerials after some time of not using HF for a while. And I now know I have to do some work on my HF antenna. It's not very happy at the moment. So over the next few days, I'll probably do some HF work to try and get my HF antennas working again. And that's what I've been up to. So all in all, I think we've all been fairly busy. Right, all that's left for me to do now is to thank the guys. I'd like to thank Mr. Dan Romanchik KB6NU for joining me.
My pleasure as always.
Cheers, Dan. I'd like to thank Mr. Edmund Spicer, M0MMG, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Martin.
No probs. And last but not least, Mr. Ed Durrant, DD5LP. Thanks for joining us, Ed.
Yeah, thanks for the invite as always. Always fun.
I think so. Right, all that's left for me to do now is say 73s to you all and carry on with the rest of the podcast. 73, guys.
73.
7-3.
7-3.
Keep your amateur ham radio podcast advert free by donating less than a length of coax. Visit www.icqpodcast.com/donate now. For all the news, links and information, visit www.icqpodcast.com.
Now it's time to have a look at the news in brief from me, Colin, M6BLY. We start off with news here that in the US, the FCC were having problems from Tuesday of this week processing information in relation to licenses and application fees, etc. Now, this is a problem now appears to be rectified itself as the week carried on, and by the end of the week they're actually now saying that it's all cleared, but there's going to be a backlog of files to be processed through the system. So if you're waiting for any licensing updates, etc. in the States, this could be the reason why. So I say just to be aware, I say that some electronic batch filing systems say need to clear a backlog going through, and you should have your license details as soon as possible. May the 5th is Children's Day in Japan, and there's a special operations station going to be taking place at the Japanese Antarctic Research Expedition amateur radio station, call sign 8 Juliet 1 Romeo Lima. So they're taking part. This is their taking part in this special day, and say this will be covering on the 21 megahertz band on single sideband. And stations that prioritise communication will be given to schools, elementary, junior and high schools in Japan, and individual stations where aerial power in Japan is licensed for less than 10 watts. So they're looking to say for any Japanese students, but at the same time, you never know, if you catch them at the right time, you might be able to get that special event station in your call book as well. So that's on the 5th of May. And we finish up here with an interesting feat here of a QSO of just shy of 1,950 miles. It was 1943.3 miles to be exact. So on the 10 meter frequency of 29.600 megahertz. And it took place between Puerto Rico and Canada, where two hands were able to briefly do an exchange and got a 5 and 9. Unfortunately, I say this small window of crystal clear communication didn't last very long. But it was contact between Whiskey Papa 4 Kilo Echo Yankee and VE9 Golf Charlie Sierra in Canada, and this took place on the 20th of April. So congratulations, guys, on achieving this feat of a distance contact of 1,950 miles. So congratulations there. Right, well, now we move on to our features episode, and our features episode is from our friend and colleague Frank, Kilo 4 Foxtrot Mike Hotel, as he discusses the Fed files. As always, hope you enjoy.
And now what you've all been waiting for, this episode's feature from the ICQ podcast.
Hello, everybody. This is Frank, K4FMH Fox Mike Hotel, with another feature for the ICQ podcast. My guest today is not yet an amateur radio operator. He is an engineer in the TV industry, and back a number of years ago in the early 2000s, he looked at his TV station's tower and noticed there was another antenna there. And yes, it looked like a repeater antenna. No, don't stop the presses. That's not a news flash for an amateur radio audience. We have a lot of amateur radio repeaters on TV towers, but it wasn't for amateur radio. It was for the local Federal Bureau of Investigation office and their repeater. My guest today is Chris Paris. That observation has led to a lifelong passion for discovering and writing the Fed files since 2004. He may not have reached Mulder status on the X-Files, but we might have evidence here of something unnatural that he's seen or heard. We won't know. He has looked at federal wavelengths as a column in the Spectrum Monitor for a number of years after beginning with the famous Bob Grove publication, Monitoring Times. By day, Chris is a TV broadcast engineer involved in TV and radio broadcasting, as well as mobile television engineering for the past 3 decades. He currently is a mobile unit engineer with NEP Broadcasting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Welcome to our show, Chris.
Thank you very much, Frank. Glad to be here.
And glad to have you. Hams tend to get very myopic about listening to our frequencies. We wave our arms in contesting where we try to combine hunting and fishing. We're hunting for new stations and fishing for the rare contact, which gives us some sort of multiplier, as we like to do, and all that. And we get pretty much into navel gazing of our own frequencies. But with what's going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine in particular, with the news stories about listening to Russian troops on what we might call not what you expect hardware, the news media has really reminded us that we get blamed or credited for everything if it involves the radio. We're either ham radio operators or CBers. That's gotten things on the forefront. But I wanted to share with our listeners in this interview what you can tell us about in just simply monitoring federal radio. Ham radio operators may think there really isn't all that much that the public can listen to from federal agencies. But Chris, how wrong is that?
Well, there is actually a lot to hear, but I will say at the outset, a lot of it is encrypted. You're not going to actually hear what they're talking about, but you do get a sense that there may be something going on if you notice a bunch of federal frequencies all of a sudden becoming very active at a particular time of day or particular time in some event going on nearby. So it's more, at least in my case, it's more along the lines of what you might call signal intelligence. That is, you see busy frequencies. You may not be able to hear what they're saying, but you can get the idea that if a bunch of frequencies that you know to be the FBI or the Secret Service or the DEA might be active, you know that there's something going on. And that's kind of where my listening habits have gotten into, is I'm not necessarily looking to actually hear clear transmissions, because admittedly, most law enforcement and federal government activity on federal channels is going to be encrypted these days. They adopted encryption for their digital radios a long time ago, and so it's just become a fact of life. But it doesn't mean that everything's going to be encrypted. And quite often, it's like collecting a rare coin or a rare stamp. They come up and they're not encrypted. And you can hear quite a bit of information, quite a bit of number of transmissions that are not encrypted and have a lot of interesting and useful information.
Well,
so
let's make it clear for our audience. Things differ around the world in terms of the legalities of listening. And here in the United States, we sort of almost take it for granted that I got a radio and I got a right to listen. Well, it may not be the case in every country. Let's just get it right out there. Is it okay to listen to anything here in the States?
Pretty much. The only thing that's really technically restricted is listening to cell phone. They were basically taken away or told we couldn't listen to those frequencies back in, I believe, 1986, when they passed a law basically forbidding that. But that's really the only restricted set of frequencies that you have nowadays. You can listen to pretty much anything that's in the airwaves. It's not legal to decrypt anything that is encrypted or scrambled, as they like to say. Even if you have the means to do so, it's not legal to do so if it's not intended for your reception. But most encryption that's used today is pretty secure. It's not going to be within the reach of an individual to actually decrypt and hear what's going on. So again, I'm speaking just for the United States. Every country has their own set of laws. Some countries it's semi-legal. Some countries it's very illegal. I know in Great Britain it's not technically legal, but it's not really enforced in a lot of ways, especially listening to the aircraft band. There are a lot of airband monitors over in the UK that seem to have no problems with the legalities of it. But yeah, especially in Europe and Asia, there are very strict requirements. There are very restrictive laws against listening to various frequencies. So it does vary by country. So you kind of have to check and see what your laws are like where you live.
So in some countries, it's a little like driving a car and speeding. Yeah, it's illegal, and sometimes it's enforced, and sometimes it's enforced harshly. So
correct.
Be careful.
Correct.
You have created, whether you meant to or not, a pretty good community. I read your column every month. The Spectrum Monitor and its predecessor, Monitoring Times, was one of those magazines that it was the cover to cover, just like I was a young kid. You know, hey, wow, it's here. I got to see what's in there. So I'm a very ardent reader. I don't have as much time as I used to listen, although that comes when there's important things. Do you have a sense of about how many people monitor U.S. government frequencies in terms of just your impressions for the community that you've built and operates really around a lot of what you do?
That's an interesting question. I do know that there are quite a few people out there, but they tend to be tend to keep quiet about it. I do get a lot of feedback from readers of my column, a lot of interesting questions, a lot of comments sometimes, and I know that from past surveys that people have taken at Monitoring Times and the Spectrum Monitor, that my columns do seem to garner a lot of attention and a lot of fans, which is nice. But if you look at some of the federal-based email lists that are on the internet, and even the federal groups on like Radio Reference, there's not a ton of activity, or the people that are there are pretty much the same groups of people all the time. So it seems like we're a fairly small number of people, but they're very active, and they do show up occasionally if there's something interesting to talk about. But I think a lot of people are just kind of like, yeah, I can listen to it, but I'm not going to make a big deal out of it and spread the word, so to speak. They kind of keep quiet and keep it to themselves. So I think there's more people out there than we know about and that I know about that are interested in monitoring this kind of stuff.
Let me just give a couple of links to our listeners at this point. And you mentioned one, radioreference.com. It is sort of labeled as a scanner group, but it really is much more than that today. It may have begun with that. And particularly as states like my own here in Mississippi, we've got a composite, what I'd call your thing, the big slow Slurpee. Everybody's on it, and they want everybody on it so they can help pay for it, whether it works or not all the time. But what you have is crowdsourced data, and that's an important thing, I think, to bring up here in our topic. Even though people don't hold public meetings called ham club meetings open to all and really talk about all the secret squirrel stuff that they happen to have heard, there is a lot of sharing information. RadioReference.com is one source. The magazine that you write for that I've mentioned, the SpectrumMonitor.com, is the successor to Monitoring Times, and it's just a marvelous magazine. Now, the editor, Ken Reach, was, I think, very prescient. In academic publishing, I've been editor. I've started journals. I kind of know what typesetting is and what the mechanics are, and also what the fiscal side of that. You got to sell to make it work. I think he was very astute in going PDF only. And he's also has a trust system where it's not complicated for you to have a password and all this stuff. And he kind of trusts his subscribers. Hey, don't do me dirty and just give it away to everybody in your club or something. He doesn't mind if you share a copy so people can see what it's like, but just kind of don't make a habit of it. And it's a marvelous magazine. He does I can speak from personal experience, and you do every month, but there's a little shade tree author in Monitoring Times. He's just a wonderful editor to work with, and having been on that side of the editor's desk, I really, really appreciate that. So those are two great sources, but I want to go to your blog, the Fed Files blog. It's mt-fedfiles.blogspot.com, and I'll bet your friend Google or DuckDuckGo with the Fed Files blog will find it and get it for you. It's organized around some headings that I think make it very easy for the viewer to take a look at. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm east of Vicksburg, one of the sites of the Army Corps of Engineers. And in fact, their entire radio system is managed by a ham who's a retiree of the Corps, as they would call it, who's now back as a private contractor to manage their radio system. Eddie Pettis is his name, and he's a very good guy in satellites and stuff. And so he knows the Army Corps stuff up and down the Mississippi River, one of their big obligations. I listen to the Corps, Army Corps of Engineers frequency. What is BATFE? What in the world is that acronym, Chris?
That's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
There have been some movies made about that agency, sir.
They used to be just the ATF, but their responsibilities have grown over the years. So,
and my friend Scott Wright, K0MD, a native of Kentucky, likes to wear Kentucky blue, as your website is adorned in now in Minnesota, and a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic. I think he grew up calling them revenuers.
Yeah, that was how they got started. Was liquor revenues. Yeah, liquor
CPB
tax.
frequency. What is that?
That is the Customs and Border Protection Division of the Department of Homeland Security. They used to be just the Customs Bureau back when they were with the Treasury Department.
Well, if you go to Arizona, Southern California, or Texas for sure, you want to make sure that you carry a radio and that you've looked at the Fed Files blog and you've got the frequencies there, because it just might be interesting. Now, we make movies about DEA as well, so you got the DEA frequencies area, and I suspect that's both very sensitive to some operations. Obviously, they would encrypt many of those, but you can get an idea when your scanner lights up or your SDR that covers those frequencies. What's been your experience in trying to garner information about the DEA?
There's been a lot of changes in their frequencies over the last decade or so. They used to operate on a lot of federal UHF frequencies in the 400 to 420 megahertz band, so they were pretty reliably there. But over the last decade, they've started moving into the VHF federal bands because more and more agencies have started purchasing the multi-band portable radios and mobile radios so that they can operate on more than one band. And so they've started to move towards VHF frequencies, I think, to be more in line with other agencies of the Justice Department, which primarily used VHF. So it's basically just been searching and looking for new active frequencies. A lot of regions about 10 years ago thought that the DEA had just basically gone off the air because none of their 400 megahertz frequencies had any activity. And that's when we started discovering that they started showing up on VHF channels. So it's not really finding information on through printed guides or through official sources. It's just basically listening and searching on the air, looking for frequencies that are active that might be there used by them.
There's a couple of things here. Since 9/11, with something called the Homeland Security as an agency, the the notion of interoperability almost on the fly becomes, or mission critical, as we would say. So you can kind of understand a good bit of what Chris is saying here. The second thing about that is that a lot of this probably couldn't happen without the internet to share this kind of activity. Remember in the old days, back when Bob Grove started what became the Monitoring Times with probably a ditto machine or certainly a photocopier, and you just couldn't get the information out there. So how important is the internet and this crowdsourcing and sharing of, if you will, civilian intel about, hey, here's what I'm hearing, or what are you hearing there?
Well, it's really important. It's gotten a lot more important in the last couple of decades because, yeah, you're right. There aren't really any official outlets or any sources that you can go to that get this stuff other than groups and websites and email lists and so forth. That's been the biggest way we've been able to combine information or to see what everybody else is hearing and share information. I do remember back in the early days where they used to put out a lot of printed books of federal frequencies. Tom Nitel's book of top secret U.S. federal government frequencies
remember
was a
it well.
big popular seller, but it only came out once a year, I think, if even that, maybe more or less often than that. And that took a lot of preparation and printing and so forth. And often by the time it came out, it was already out of date. There were frequencies that were changed or new frequencies popped up, and we didn't find out about them until the next year, the next edition came out. So having this exchange of information over the internet and these groups and mail lists is a lot closer to real time than it was back in the old days with the printed information.
Tom Nitel was probably the Art Bell of scanning and radio before Art Bell became famous. Obviously, Art Bell, now a silent key as a ham. One thing that our listeners who were SWLs may identify with is the old Popular Electronics WPE monitoring call sign. And if you weren't a ham, you had to be a little envious. So you can get your own call sign. Mm-hmm. And Tom Nitel ran that himself with postage stamps and things like that. And I wish I could find my old WPE certificate. It got lost in a move at some point. But the old days of sharing that sort of information has sort of gotten ramped up. And things like your blog and your columns that you engage in, and hopefully appearing on podcasts like this one, will help spark continued interest. One thing that we've covered lately has been this kerfuffle and more with the FAA and with the cellular industry, with the FCC somewhere around the middle of all that, with some frequency changes and their altimeter measurement devices. The FAA frequencies are probably the entry portal for so many people who buy a scanner or some receiver that can hear a lot of stuff. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Aviation monitoring and the FAA aviation frequencies are very popular. There's large groups of people who are very into that, kind of combined with the people who do plane spotting, even who go out to the airports and actually watch for certain planes to come in. And so, yeah, that's a very popular part of it. I do it here at home. I've got several scanners just loaded with the FAA frequencies of what's going on around me, including their land mobile networks. But yeah, mostly aviation, mostly airplanes. And that's part of the hobby that I really enjoy too.
Well, now, it's a secret to our listeners who don't look at your blog and don't read your column, but to think that we're just kind of radio nerds and we don't get into sports would truly be a misnomer, because you, sir, attend the Super Bowl, do you not?
I do, every year for the last 15 years, at least, for work.
And so tell us a little bit about the listening at the Super Bowl.
Well, it's quite extensive. I mean, it's a big public event. There's all kinds of things going on there besides the game. There's all kinds of comms going on as far as public safety, police, fire, the security around the facility, and of course, federal agencies. These, since 9/11, these big kind of public events have become potential targets for whatever, terrorist attacks or even natural disasters. So there's a lot of planning, a lot of activity going on as far as providing as much support and security and intelligence over possible threats to these big events with a lot of public attending. So this last Super Bowl, when I was out in California at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, was literally like trying to drink from a fire hose. There were just so many active frequencies, not only with the local police, state CHP and federal government, county, and so forth. It was just, it took every scanner I had with me to keep track of what was going on, and I probably could have used a couple more.
Let's give a little plug. You recently appeared on a podcast that's called Scanner School. So there are schools where the so-called newbie, if they want to really ramp up their chops in terms of understanding what we typically call scanning, tell us a little bit about that podcast and your appearance on it.
Oh, yeah. I've appeared on a couple of podcasts for Phil Lichtenberger's Scanner School. He really has got an interesting setup going, trying to help people who are just getting into the scanning hobby to learn how to get more out of it, to learn how to do new things. Because I remember back when I first started playing with scanners, I didn't really understand frequency spectrums, where certain people might be using, what frequencies they might be using, where to even look for some frequencies or where agencies might be. And so he helps with that kind of initial learning, trying to get people familiar with how to use your scanner, how to get more out of it, what to listen to, what you can listen to, what you can't listen to. And more recently, he's gotten into actually having some online courses about SDRs, software-defined radios, and how you can actually buy a relatively inexpensive SDR dongle and plug it in and be listening to stuff all over the spectrum fairly quickly. So I think he's really helping getting a lot of new people into this hobby who may not have ever thought of getting into it before.
Certainly the so-called USB dongle radio that with just a little bit of reading and, if you will, monkey see, monkey do, step A, step B, step C, oh, I didn't screw it up and it's working, can get you on for, I don't know, $20, $25, depending on what you buy. Well, it's always good to have a source where you can go and get up to speed pretty quickly. And we said, school's out for the summer. I'll never do it again. And yet we get interested in learning new things, Chris. So
Absolutely.
It's always good to have a good source of that.
Absolutely.
Do you think when there is a war or times of conflict, do you think that ramps up interest in the kind of things that you write about?
I do. I know for a fact that over the last couple of years, especially during the couple of years ago, and when we've had a lot of social unrest in some cities in the U.S., the pandemic and people locked up at home for a while, scanner sales went through the roof. Shortwave radio sales went through the roof. And a lot of people have had trouble keeping them. A lot of vendors have had trouble keeping them in stock. So people are interested in that kind of stuff, and they do look for information. They do look for listening to what they can and seeing what they can hear over these things. Yeah, it's definitely generated a lot more interest in that kind of stuff, I think, when we have things going on, not just the war in Europe, but I mean, like I said, during the pandemic and during riots here in the U.S. So yeah, that definitely generates interest.
Ted Randall, who operates WTWW, the commercial shortwave broadcasting station just outside of Nashville, and his wife Holly, he's talked about Texan manufacturing as many as 10,000 shortwave radios of various makes and models a day, and many of them go to third world country. And I think times of war simply bring it to the news media that we watch here in the first world about what the third world tends to deal with. Chris, I want to point out a free resource to our listeners for the United States. I suspect there are equivalents, certainly in Europe and Australia and other places. And that's an agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. Now, for those of us over a certain age, you may have to get your glasses out for this because they have a free color chart called United States Frequency Allocations, the Radio Spectrum. And I suspect you may have referred to this in bits and pieces at times, but it's this multicolored chart with little fine slices in some places of who is allocated to which frequency. And if you have any interest in what Chris is telling us about, and you're in the U.S. or just want to learn about frequency allocations in general, is worth looking at, because you might think, wow, radio astronomy is there? You mean I can hear stuff from outer space? See, I told you we were going to get Mulder in here with the X-Files sooner or later, Chris.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that chart. That is a very useful chart. I wish I'd had one back when I started in this hobby, so I had a better idea of where to start looking for all these frequencies.
With the internet, it started raining CD-ROMs once the internet started. That was one thing. But secondly, just making it easier for federal agencies to get their stuff out to the public. And that's certainly one of them. The FBI frequencies are one tab on your website. So that's what got you started. Why did that intrigue you when you just you were there? Hey, that was your tower. You were an engineer there. What intrigues you about that?
I guess what intrigued me most was just the curiosity. I wanted to know, I wanted to figure out what frequency they were on. I had no idea at the time. Like I said, I wasn't very attuned to the different frequency bands and which agencies might be in which band. And again, we're back before the internet, at least when this first happened to me. So it was a challenge to try and figure out what they might have been using for the frequency. And I didn't have really access to like a spectrum analyzer or a frequency counter at the time, just a programmable scanner. So I did a lot of searching and listening, and as it turns out, they weren't that busy at the time. So I really had a hard time actually tracking them down. I did years later, but yeah, it became kind of a challenge to me. And that's what's kind of driven my interest in a lot of federal stuff. It's just a challenge of trying to figure out something that most people wouldn't know or wouldn't have any idea how to figure out. So that's what kind of drives me. That's what kind of drives my searching when I travel, looking for new frequencies, looking for interesting stuff. Yeah, that's what's driven me, is the interest in finding out these new frequencies. I still take radios with me and search, and I'm constantly finding new things in cities that I've been to before that I hadn't heard before. I find new frequencies that hadn't been active before. So that's its reward to me, is finding new activity on frequencies that hadn't been heard before.
How often do you use the features, and they're called different things? I know Uniden calls it one thing, and Whistler or somebody else may call it something else, where you put it in a mode where it's just an RF sniffer and it sort of just tries to figure out what's going on nearby.
Sure. The Unidens call that a close call, and I think the Whistlers still call it spectrum sweeper. Basically just what they call a near field monitor. It's looking for very strong signals to stop on. It's usually monitoring a very broad set of frequencies. And I use it fairly often. I sometimes keep one of my radios in my personal vehicle set to that mode as I'm driving around town, and I'll pick up businesses, I'll pick up school buses, I may pick up a police car that's next to me at a red light. It's interesting sometimes to come across active frequencies that, like I said, didn't know where they were there, didn't know they were there before, but it's been a very useful tool for a lot of things. You do have to be close by. You're not going to pick up stuff from miles and miles away. You've got to be fairly close by. But when you're near a particular facility, say, or like a government building or a hospital or a sports stadium, having that running will often reveal active frequencies in that area where you're working.
Back in the late 90s, I was in Washington a lot and happened to need to go to the State Department for a meeting. I was attached to United States Department of Agriculture. And so I went to the State Department building there. And, many of the buildings in Washington are built somewhat similarly, fairly nondescript stone building. And we had the meeting, went home, but I read in the paper about 6 months later how a Russian agent had been parked on the street near the State Department using something similar to what you're talking about, a sniffer, to try to see if they could hear any radio transmissions coming out of the State Department to use as an entryway, if you will, for further poking. Sounds kind of like computer hacking to me from some of my former students, but there's a history, isn't there, Chris, with spy tools going back to the origins of the OSS and the CIA involving radio. We have collectibles where, the spy suitcase radio, and some of your other columnists may do feature stories on that in the Spectrum Monitor. But this set of techniques of trying to see what we can hear is a well-trodden tool that has been around for a number of reasons.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a specialized form of monitoring, usually referred to as signals intelligence, where you're looking for target signals. You're looking for any kind of radio frequency signals that you can pick up. Whether or not you can actually decode or decrypt what the information is in that signal is of secondary importance. A lot of times you're just looking for the initial RF emissions to help you gain some kind of intelligence advantage. See if you can take that information and work on it further after you've figured out what signals are actually on the airwaves.
This may get over into one of your fellow columnists area, Hugh Stegman or something, but there's such a fascination with the numbers stations and the popular TV series called The Americans that were two Russian spies that were in place for a while before they were activated, and they would get an old transistor shortwave receiver out and they would listen for some of these numbers things. That's probably a tactic that has been used and was actually documented in the CIA founder's biography about some of the tradecraft that goes on on, and we may talk about that in a different podcast if I can lure Hugh out of his lair to talk to us about number stations. It's quite a cult almost, not to be negative, but it's sort of and it certainly has intrigued me as well.
Oh yeah, I've been fascinated by that thing too.
You have a section there on Treasury, TSA, and U.S. Capitol Police frequencies, and certainly what happened back on January 6th of last year in this country involving the Capitol Police. I'm involved with the American Radio Relay League's Volunteer Monitor program, and through that activity, a couple of the VMs in Washington were involved in identifying 2 amateur radio repeaters used by some of the paramilitary groups, and they were shut down actually early on by Homeland Security in that. Now, we tend to think of Capitol Police as, hey, don't throw your cigarette butts over there on the lawn, type of thing. But that's very serious business, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The U.S. Capitol Police don't just work at the Capitol, I found out. They often accompany senators or congressmen when they're out of Washington, D.C. I've come across some of their active frequencies at the Super Bowls I've been to, at other big public events, because they do often travel with VIPs from the federal government. So they are out and about all over the country and not just in Washington, D.C.
One thing that's critical, I noticed on your blog page, you've got some information about the TSA and changing some of their frequencies. And it's not just that they're trying to change them willy-nilly. They have contractors and other teams that work for the federal government that manage their comms, because I think Napoleon said that army travels on its stomach. Well, we might say today that any agency travels on its comms in so many ways. I think the Russians and Ukraine are finding out a little bit about that from what we see in the news media today. These things change, and they can change very rapidly, can't they?
Oh, absolutely. The TSA kind of interested me because, A, it's one of the few federal agencies that I think I run into more than any other because of all my traveling that I do. I run into the TSA every time I get on an airplane. So that's one of the federal agencies I actually rub elbows with occasionally. But this is one of the few times that I've seen an actual federal agency transition from one set of frequencies to a completely new set of frequencies in mass. And that's the very rare. A lot of federal agencies will stick with frequencies they've had for many, many decades. But the TSA is making the move to a completely new set of frequencies. And again, we don't have any official source for these. We have to find them by actually monitoring what's going on at the airports or at the TSA checkpoints. So it's a bit of a challenge trying to find something new like that.
Well, while radio stuff is what we and our listeners to this episode certainly get into a lot, you think about the rank and file TSA employee, that's just something they wear on their belt, or they're at a dispatch unit, or they're somewhere else. And so to get a rollout like that in mass, that's quite a big operation. Indeed, the Park Service polices a long federal park called the Natchez Trace Parkway. And I live within 1 mile of the Natchez Trace Parkway. I live on a reservoir that's state-owned called the Barnett Reservoir, and on the other side of me is the Natchez Trace. There's a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit. And I used to drive a Porsche convertible, and you can do the math on that.
Okay.
I never got caught, and I will say I probably went a little faster than 50. But a ham radio colleague of mine who's on my portable ops team is an engineer for a 3-letter cellular company. And Thomas was stopped by the park police. And they, when you get a federal ticket, people don't realize they start at about $600, and then you look at your penalty, and you go to federal court, and they'll come get you if you don't appear. It's much more than just getting a traffic ticket here with a local jurisdiction. And
Indeed.
He was sort of saying, I'm really sorry for going over 50. I was up visiting my son up at Mississippi State. The normal thing that he would say. And he said, oh, so you're an engineer. You do radio stuff. He said, yeah, I'm a ham radio operator too. He said, now I've stopped you. You got about 5 minutes. Can you help me do something? And so he went to the trooper's car, and he thought he had broken his radio because he had done something and it had come loose and it was crackling. It wasn't working. And so Thomas kind of repaired everything. And he said, okay, you're off this time. He said, just don't lead foot it in the future. So he actually repaired that person's radio for him. And it was a new radio, and it was not long after they had gone encrypted. Mm-hmm. So what I go by, Chris, is I have a scanner and I have a disc on antenna in my attic. I can hear fairly well. Got a little preamp on it. I don't go by what I can't understand. I go by the volume. Something's going on because there's a lot of activity. And having former students that work at Fort Meade for the National Security Agency in SIG-INT, I just know the volume speaks louder than words sometimes. And that's part of what you know when something's up. And so for us out here in the civilian world who just like to listen and like to figure things out, your website and the people that you bring together, along with the Spectrum Monitor and some other sources that we've mentioned, are just great sources for that. If you live near a coastal area in the United States, the Coast Guard has got to be a fun listen.
Oh, absolutely. Coast Guard is right up there, I think, with aviation monitoring in a lot of places, because boaters and anything that travels out on the water is of their concern a lot of times. And especially when you're talking about international waters down in Florida along the California coast, they're also concerned with smugglers and potential threats coming in. So they're very busy, and they're very interesting to listen to. Now, unfortunately, a lot of their normal operational channels in some areas have gone encrypted, but in some areas they are digital, but they're not encrypted. So it's kind of a coin toss to find out if you can actually listen to them or not. Their marine channels are still in the clear, so those are still active and easy to keep track of.
One of the things that might be the button that a lot of people would click on is the last one on your main set of tabs, and that is the Secret Service. Now, people think the Secret Service does stuff that's secret, but I had an opportunity with a group of people to attend the SEC Conference Basketball Championship for men for 28 years in a row. And one friend couldn't make it, and he asked me to sell his ticket. So I did. This guy gave me $300, $20 bills. Okay, they looked fine. Got them back to him, and his wife took it to the bank 2 weeks later. They were very nice to her because they didn't suspect she was a counterfeiter, but they called the Secret Service, and the Secret Service agent came over and interviewed her.
Oh, wow.
So and of course, she was fine. He was out $300 because, it looked good. It looked like good print. So the Secret Service does a lot of things. Tell us a little bit about what you can hear when trying to listen to the Secret Service.
Well, as you were right, they do other things besides protect VIPs and the president and vice president, so forth. They are active in a lot of other things. They're very interested in cybercrime these days, financial crimes, as well as counterfeiting. They've done, I think they also are involved in a lot of the planning for these big special events like the Super Bowls and stuff. They're heavily involved in that as far as intelligence and pre-planning. So they're very active. They also protect not only the president, vice president, but also a lot of the cabinet members. So when we had the director of the Department of Homeland Security come out to the football stadium, he had a Secret Service detail with him. They have a fairly large number of frequencies that you can hear. Again, they're mostly encrypted, but they're not always encrypted. We've run into some unencrypted transmissions, especially when they're preparing a setup or preparing someplace for an arrival, or after the protectee has left, they'll sometimes go in the clear. But you can get a good idea if somebody interesting is in the area if you all of a sudden start hearing one of their frequencies get active over at a certain time. But yeah, there are quite a few frequencies, especially if you're in the Washington, D.C. area. They're just always active there. So, but it's kind of a random thing whether or not you can actually hear them in the clear or not. But they are out there and they are busy, and they do use their radios quite a bit.
When I was a faculty member at Mississippi State, we had the pleasure of having the first President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, give a graduation speech. He was a friend with a member of Congress from Mississippi, and he came down, and a good friend of mine was on the campus security team, more moving tables and things rather than security per se. And one of the things they did to protect the president was to have a long chute. So before he got to the podium, you really didn't know where he was. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the security mechanisms. And he was tying down these tents, and he was down on his knees trying to tie this knot, and he was trying to cut this cord. And he said, I've got to go get the scissors. A member of the Secret Service was walking by. He said, here, let me get that. He reached down his leg, came out with a knife, cut it, put it back. He never broke stride in doing that. Now, they did have a scare because a graduate student in agricultural economics had gotten a scope for his rifle. He was going to Montana during spring break for hunting. and he left the box in his little graduate Carroll office, and that was discovered, and there was a thorough investigation because here's a box for a scope for a sniper rifle, as they feared. Chris, we've covered a number of topics on your webpage. It's a great website. There's more than we have talked about. You've done this since 2004. You know, somebody might say, wow, hadn't you heard it all? I mean, what keeps you going on this?
Well, like I said, I think there's always potential to find something new, some new activity. It's always a potential to find some radio transmissions that are not encrypted. Again, it's just a very random thing. It's luck of the draw. And so that's what keeps me interested in it. Like with the TSA, there's always a possibility that some agencies might change channels, might change frequencies. So it takes a little effort to kind of keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, keep your radios going on new and different frequencies just to see what might change. So that's kind of what keeps me interested is the possibility of change, the possibility of finding something new, just really knowing what's going on in the airwaves around me.
If you were advising someone who said, hey, that sounds really cool, got a little bit of money, I can get into this, and I don't know whether to get something from a house or get more of a handheld thing to begin with, what would you advise somebody to do just to get started?
Well, if you really want to get interested in federal monitoring, I would recommend probably a handheld scanner to start with, because you can take that a lot of different places, use it in a lot of different situations rather than a base type scanner that you leave at home or have mounted in your car. The only specialty you really need to worry about nowadays is probably having a scanner that's capable of digital reception. Almost all federal digital radios are going to be using the APCO P25 digital mode. And that's pretty standard on most new model scanners now that are digital capable. So there's really not any specific equipment that you need for monitoring federal stuff. It's pretty basic once you get the digital capable scanner.
Just make sure you get digital. So if you find something in a pawn shop or at a yard sale, it might hear some stuff. But you really want to make sure that when you get into it, you want to get something that'll hear digital, right?
Absolutely. Now, that's not to say that all federal activity is digital. There are quite a bit of federal agencies that are not digital, particularly when it comes to agencies in some national parks, U.S. Forest Service, some of the Department of Energy, Bonneville Power Administration, various agencies like that are not necessarily law enforcement. They often still use analog radios. And so those are receivable by almost any scanner within the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, good. What else would you like our listeners to know about monitoring federal frequencies in the U.S.? Probably some topics we could spend a long time on, but what would be something that I really didn't bring up?
Well, I would recommend for somebody, especially if they've already had a scanner and listened to their local police and fire, that monitoring the federal channels is not going to be the same. It's going to be very different. You're not going to hear constant traffic. You're not going to hear dispatchers for different calls. So forth. Federal activity can be very cyclical. It can be very busy one day. It can be very quiet for several days after. It just depends on the cases that some of these agencies are working on, depends on the situation, depends on the facility that you're listening to. Some facilities, particularly the post office, are busy constantly. They just chatter and talk all the time because they're processing mail 24 hours a day at some of these postal sorting facilities. So that would be, interesting to listen to in some cases. Not always, but in some cases. But others.
Can you get an idea if your mail is going to be late due to weather? I mean, would that be kind of chatter you might hear?
I've heard that kind of talk, whether they've got broken down trucks or bad sorting machines. There's all kinds of information you can get from that kind of monitor. But on the other hand, there may be agencies like we were talking about, the DEA. You may hear some activity on their channels for a couple of days, and then you may not hear anything for a month. One thing that's changed a lot is the fact that almost everybody's got a cell phone now. And in the old days, federal agents used to call in to the office for various things on their radio. So you could almost guarantee that everybody would be talking on the radio on the way into the office or on the way out of the office in the afternoon. They don't do that much more on the radio. It's all done on their cell phones. So the radios, when they get into use, are usually for more important communication, something that they need done right away, or they need to talk to multiple people and not just make a phone call.
I'll share this with you as we close. One of the things that I heard when we moved here to just north of Jackson to Ridgeland, Mississippi, and I was putting channels from radioreference.com, do your frequency search, download them directly into your scanner, in my case, a Uniden. Just really, really easy by comparison. For our listeners, they'll know what this is. Think of a Baofeng HT and programming it, and then think of the opposite. It's kind of like on the opposite end of that. But I heard a local police agency Friday called for a check-in, and one unit didn't check in. And they finally called him out explicitly. And let's just say he was at a place that they do check on when they have rowdy behavior, but it would be in an industrial area that they've zoned for adult activities to be located. And they finally called him out, and he finally said, "I'm not supposed to be here." And I guess he thought that if he whispered on the radio that people couldn't really hear that.
Yes.
And Chris, that taught me that the little option on the Uniden that I have that will allow you to record when there's a signal so you don't get a lot of dead air time, it would record the disc.
Yeah.
And I shared that with a reporter friend of mine with the Jackson Clarion Ledger. He's since retired. He said, "You have those for 30 days?" He said, "If I call you, can you give me audio?" I said, "Hey, sure, no problem." There's a lot of opportunity here for our listeners to expand their hobby. Some of them may already be into it. But I think Chris Paris has given us a very, very good introduction, and he does a great job with his blog and his columns. I encourage you to visit thespectrummonitor.com and the Fed Files blog at mt-fedfiles.blogspot.com. He is a TV engineer in the mobile area in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, home of KDKA. Nobody can find fault with that. Now, the Steelers, on the other hand, depends on who you root for, friend. Chris, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Frank. I enjoyed it.
7-3. And that's it for this feature. I hope our listeners can learn more about how their federal government, especially here in the States, communicates over the air. Those hams who practice emergency communications will greatly benefit from reading the Fed Files blog and column in the Spectrum Monitor, because they'll no doubt better understand the operations of the agencies that they try to serve. For those outside of the U.S., please get knowledgeable about the laws of government monitoring where you live. There may be similar blogs and sources of government monitoring information in your country. For now, this is Fox Mike Hotel saying, ICQ, do you?
The ICQ podcast, advert free since 2008.
Well, many thanks there to Frank, Kilo 4, Foxtrot Mike Hotel, and his feature on the Fed Files. As always, we really hope you enjoyed that feature there that we put together for you from there. Alright, a small correction to make for my news roundtable. So the guys have asked me to let you know that when referring to Dorking in the Surrey, UK, they should have referred to it as the lightning capital of the UK and not the world. So just to let you know of that slight correction there. So Dorking in Surrey is the lightning capital of the UK. We'd like to tell you about the Digital Voice the activity day that we've got coming up. We're going to be doing the activity day on the 14th of May. It's a Saturday. It's going to be starting on 0800 UTC and ending at 2000 hours UTC. So an opportunity to get on during the day and maybe have a chat with your favourite ICQ podcast presenter. But more importantly, as an opportunity to show the wonderful uses of the talk group and get in touch with your fellow ICQ podcast listeners. We've got a lot of modes bridged and connected together, and you can find out more about this by going to digitalgroup.icqpodcast.com. Well, all that's left for me to do is to thank the kind people that help us put together this show for you. So we'd like to thank the monthly and annual subscription donors, along with Scott McDonald, Kilo Alpha 9 Papa, for their very kind support to the ICQ podcast. Thank you again, guys. As your very kind donations, etc., keep us advert free, paying our way, and making sure all our bills are paid to keep us on the air and working away for you from there. If you would like to help us out, it's a very easy thing to do. All you need to do is go to icqpodcast.com/donate, and say any donation you send our way is always greatly appreciated. I'd also like to thank Dan, Kilo Bravo 6, November Uniform, Edmund, Mike 0, Mike November Golf, and Ed DD5 Lima Papa for the very kind time joining Martin M1LB for the News Roundtable. Right, that just about wraps up everything from our end here at the moment. As I say, so we'll be catching up with you all again in a fortnight's time as we get ready to do episode 376. So until then, 73's all, guys, and hope you continue to enjoy the hobby. 73's all.